So SPARQL is quite similar to SQL in at least its syntax. So for people who are already familiar with SQL and relational databases, it's quite easy for them to start learning SPARQL. But often what we find is, it's very easy for them to learn how to write sort of the basic queries and to get themselves started. But often they don't necessarily take full advantage of SPARQL when they first start, because some of the things you can do with SPARQL are just you cannot do with SQL, and so that people don't even think to try them. So sort of the classic example of that is sort of the complex join. Typically people who've worked with SQL for a long time often kind of have this aversion to writing queries that do a lot of joins, because as good as relational databases are at doing joins, there comes a point where your join becomes too complex and the system just can't handle it anymore. You go from being able to run queries in a couple of seconds to queries that take you days to run. And often in sort of corporate environments, you're warned off. Don't write those queries. You're not allowed to run them because there's many people trying to use the system. Those kind of queries are just not permitted. So whereas SPARQL, by its very nature, is designed around doing joins. I mean, pretty much everything you do in SPARQL is a join between some data. And so SPARQL processors, and particularly Eureka, are very geared towards doing complex joins. They're very good at doing, multi-way joins very, very fast, and allow you to ask these sort of complex questions, get these complex patterns out of your data that you just can't get out of, SQL database easily. And the other advantage in terms of joins is with SQL, you very much need to know exactly the structure of your data in order to make a useful join. So you need to know, that the tables you're trying to join together have some relation that you can actually make a join on. There's some common data between those two tables that you can actually join on. So say you've got people, the people in your company and their roles in the company. And you're assuming there is some field that tells you, this person has this role in the company. You can make that join. So by its nature, the RDF data model and SPARQL queries don't require you to have that a priori knowledge of the data schema. So you can say, find me things that are people, find me things that are job roles, and and just sort of arbitrarily make that connection between people and their job role without necessarily needing to know how it's expressed in the database. So you could say, find me something that is a person. This thing has some roles, and these roles have some other information associated with, like what their actual, their job title is, say. And you can do those sort of simple queries work well in SQL, but in SPARQL you can do them you can make them much more complex. You can start pulling in all sorts of different, alternative sources of data, because the data is naturally joinable by the way it's encoded. You've not got to worry so much about, do the way the values are encoded in this table naturally line up with the way the values are encoded in another table, because typically the way you express your RDF data would naturally do a lot of that for you. So it's much easier to join arbitrary things together. And going back to the notion of not needing the a priori knowledge, with SQL, you can't even ask a query unless you know what the database looks like. You need to, at the bare minimum, you would need to know what the name of a table is. And if you want to actually start asking anything useful, you've got to know, what are the names of the columns I'm interested in, and once you start doing even more, once you start going beyond that, well, I want to find, these columns, but only where they have these values, then you need to know, what are the types of the data that are in those columns in order to, express your constraint appropriately. So one of the advantages SPARQL has is that you can start with a database you know absolutely nothing about, and just start asking questions, just simply, find me all the types that are expressed in this data, what properties are, and then what properties are used in conjunction with those types, which essentially, finding what are the columns of the data essentially. And you can start with some, very simple queries and sort of quite rapidly start drilling down into the data, start finding out useful things, start actually discovering what the structure of the data, how things relate to each other, and fairly quickly get to the point where you can actually ask useful queries. Whereas if you were just stuck in front of an unknown SQL database, even being able to, you couldn't do that at all unless you had sort of the privileges to, particularly, there's typically sort of security issues as well in SQL data, the way the data is kind of partitioned, you may not even be able to ask those questions of what is the schema in an SQL database, whereas you can quite naturally ask those in the SPARQL because of the structure of the data. My name is Rob Vesey, and this has been a Eureka Moment.